It's Wednesday, August 16th, 2023, and today, well, it's Wednesday, August 16th. And this is KBIA's Views of the News. Our weekly roundtable on media behaviors comes to you from the Futures Lab studio at the Reynolds Journalism Institute. I'm Amy Simons, and here with me are my colleagues Kiely and Earnest Perry. As we start season 16 of our little program, and Earnest, it's the start of, get this, our 10th year sitting around this table. And as you can imagine, we have lots to talk about, having been off since mid-May, like the fourth indictment handed down against former President Donald Trump. We'll talk about what we saw Monday night and how that made it feel a little bit different than the other three, to me at least. We'll talk about the wildfires still burning in Maui, and talks picked back up this weekend, but no agreement yet in the Hollywood strikes. We'll talk about what's changed this summer and what we've all been watching while production has stopped. But we're going to start with Friday's raid on the office of the Marion County Record. Police seized computers, cell phones, and reporting materials from the office and homes of reporters and the publisher and his family. But it didn't stop there. Now, Kathy, no matter what it is that I write in the script to set this story up, I'm never going to be able to adequately describe what really happened here and how egregious it really was. So you go ahead and fill us in.
Yeah, well, a raid on a newspaper office is almost unheard of, and there's a good reason for that, because the press is protected in the Constitution as a watchdog, and of course, watchdogs make people angry, and so the idea is that you have to get over a number of legal hurdles in order to do what the Marion County Police Department did, and they didn't do that. So I think they're in a world of legal trouble. And but fortunately, I will say the Marion County paper was able to publish today. I heard there'll be an interesting backstory on that, because one of the big problems in taking that equipment, it's almost like prior restraint on publication, because it really crippled the newspaper in terms of its ability to get itself published. So the police came in to the newsroom. They took equipment. They even took, and apparently there was a little wrestling match with one of the reporters to get her cell phone. And then worse, they came into the home of the owner of the newspaper, who was living with his 98-year-old mother, who had also been a part of the newspaper, and took equipment from the home as well. And it was extremely upsetting to the mother, 98 years old, who told the Kansas City Star, or the Wichita Eagle, one of them, these are Hitler tactics. Something has to be done. And the next day she died. So that, was it cause and effect? Hard to say, but it's certainly something that Eric Meyer, the newspaper owner, is alleging. And it's an amazing story to see it happening in the United States of America.
Yeah, I mean, when you sit down and think about it, so you had the police chief who was supposedly under investigation by the newspaper, go to the judge, who, in most cases like this, the judge will grant a subpoena. Mm-hmm. And then it goes to another hearing to determine whether or not the newspaper or media entity turns over the evidence.
Yeah, it gives the paper a chance to
respond and to perform if there's reason.
Right. And in this case,
that stuff was skipped over entirely.
Exactly. And I'm sort of, in reading the stories and hearing about this, I'm just sort of baffled as to, number one, what was the judge thinking in this? Because it's almost like a two-step process here, where someone should have said, wait a minute, this is not a good idea. We're going to go this route instead of this route. And you sort of start thinking, was it an effort to stop publication? Because that's effectively what was happening here. Was it some piece of information that you knew was going to come out in a potential story that you wanted to stop? So when you start looking at the story, the more and more you get into it, the more I keep thinking as someone who's observing this from the outside, and my understanding of how newspapers and news operations work. There seemed to be some sort of we want to stop something from getting out publicly.
Exactly. And I think the other thing, this all smells like a small town that's run by a small group of people, right, and they're protecting each other. It was, kind of a closed system. And to me, what it really does is it emphasizes how important the work of local newspapers like the Marion Record are, because it's too easy. Power corrupts. We all say that. And that's why you want to have checks and balances. And one of those checks and balances is the press. And so it sounds like this newspaper owner, Eric Meyer, who is a veteran of big city newsrooms and then a veteran of the classroom. He taught for many years journalism, and now he's gone back to his hometown, and he's really applying some of that very aggressive journalism to cover his town. That's what we should have in America. Right. We should have more of that in America, because if you watch cable news, you would think there is only one elected official in this country. We need to have people covering city council, the mayor's office, the local police, the school board, to remind people where the levers of power really are. And so for somebody like this to be going through this sort of an ordeal, I mean, this guy should have a statue built to him instead of a court case. But he does have a good lawyer now, so and I think that'll be it's going to be really interesting to see how this goes through.
To me, it's going to be interesting because if the story is correct, there was certain things in the police chief's background that those who hired him should have known and didn't know, and Eric Meyer and his staff were basically reporting on these things. And apparently, this other issue that came up involving another powerful person in the community, they used that as a pretext to then go in and be able to do what they did in terms of confiscating all of their equipment and pretty much trying to shut the newspaper down.
Yeah, it's hard to say, but I think the worst thing is this is all going to come out in court now. Right. It's not going to be a matter of a reporter digging. It's going to be a judge ordering discovery, and it won't be a magistrate like the person who ordered this raid. It is going to be a federal judge who is going to make these decisions, and I think they will rue the day.
So speaking of courtrooms, there's another small news organization that's under threat. This one is in Wisconsin, and it's buckling under the pressure of the cost of defending lawsuits that have been brought against it for reporting on the truth of what actually happened in a public meeting. In some ways, it's kind of a page out of the book of Donald Trump suing for defamation without being able to prove defamation ever really happened, and driving that business to the brink of bankruptcy in an attempt to silence them.
It's pretty much, we're going to tie you up in court to the point where you capitulate. Mm-hmm. And
if you want to stay in business, because we're going to bankrupt you in defending it.
We're going to bankrupt you in defending it. And I mean, it is a tactic that has been used over and over again by Donald Trump and others. Mm-hmm.
By dictators around the world.
Dictators around the world, absolutely. And now you have this longtime media operation that is in jeopardy of closing, not because it doesn't have a viable case, but because it can't afford to actually defend itself in court and continue to operate. And so, to me, it's one of those things where by the end, they're going to be suing the person that's suing them in hopes of getting damages to be able to either restart or do something. But that's kind of where we are right now.
Yeah, I mean, this is why you have SLAPP, the laws mm-hmm. against frivolous cases, and one would hope that would have some effect here. But I mean, honestly, this is the kind of tactics we're seeing out of the Philippines, used against Maria Ressa, out of Guatemala, used against Jose Zamora. And it's really disturbing to see this kind of thing infiltrating its way into the United States, and it's very damaging. So people need to be aware of what's really at stake here.
But there was a time when a judge would look at the evidence that's being brought in and say, like, there's no case here, and then it's gone. But now, at least in the system, what you're seeing is that these cases are allowed to go forward on very little evidence, a very scant evidence, and to me, that was one of the things that was there even before you had the SLAPP laws. Was the judge would look at it and go like, wait a minute, there's
no there there.
There's no there there. I'm dismissing this case, and that's not happening.
And you have to wonder if years and years of rhetoric that is undermining the credibility of the press has something to do with that.
Right.
Okay, so speaking of the former president, the last time we were all here, it was the day after he was found responsible in the E. Jean Carroll civil case. Well, since that time in May, Donald Trump has been indicted in New York, 2 different federal courts, and Monday night in Georgia. I knew we couldn't come back from a 3-month hiatus and not talk about the indictments, but I wasn't really quite sure what there was for us to say to add to that conversation until I saw the images from the pool cameras Monday night. The clerk literally handing up the indictment to the judge reading it and handing it back. Somehow seeing that process carry out in real time, it made it seem so much more real to me, at least, than the other appearances where we would have, the drive up, the walk in, and then reporters texting from the newsroom, talking heads breathlessly reading those texts and waiting for court sketches. This felt so much different. At least to me. I'm going to throw that out there and say to me.
I think it felt different, but to me, the difference was they did it at 11 p.m. Eastern time. I mean,
they kept the courthouse
11:30
open for this.
Midnight Eastern time, when most people were getting ready, either already in bed or getting ready to go to bed, and they did it in almost like you said, they did it in the dead of night. And I think they were doing it for security reasons. They haven't really said why they did it so late, but I believe that was part of the reason why they did it. But the other thing was, we're going to be as transparent as possible about what it is we're doing, from moving from the grand jury stage to the judge's phase down to the press conference. I mean, it was one of those things where, like you said, when you look at how the other indictments basically played out and how this one played out, you had much more transparency and you could see things in motion that you didn't see in the others.
Yeah, it was interesting. I heard the former lieutenant governor of Georgia, who was a witness before that grand jury, being interviewed on KBIA this morning. And he said he would like to see the trial televised because he said he thinks members of his party, the Republican Party, need to see this. So I think it's an interesting idea. I mean, of course, those of us in the media have always wanted courtrooms open. I think it's educational for the public. I think it's much harder to game things when you've actually got the videotape and you can see what's going on. So I think it'll be interesting what decision is made. But, it's easy to demagogue in sound bites. It's a lot harder when you have a full trial going on in front of you. And I think it could be a healthy thing if this is televised.
So we have a pretty long 6 months to a year. Who knows if this could even get carried out for years to come before these 4 cases and the additional case that E. Jean Carroll has filed. There's a lot of time between when those are all going to be resolved and now. What would be on your wish list, or what advice would you give to journalists as we move into this next phase of the Trump coverage era?
I don't think that there is no way to escape this being the number one issue that's going to be asked of candidates regardless of party. Because you have a former president who is facing state and federal charges that are, to be honest with you, borderline treason. Okay. I mean, you were basically trying to
overturn an
election and stay in power. I mean, we're talking about something that happens in authoritarian governments around the world. So to me, one of the things that any journalist who's covering this election has to bring this up at the beginning of every conversation they have with whether the candidate is Ron DeSantis or the candidate is Joe Biden. You have to bring this up, and there's just no way to dodge it. Even though you're going to have former President Trump, who himself is going to bring it up, but he's going to be bringing it up to fit the narrative that he wants out there. But again, the reporters are going to have to push back on this.
Yeah, well, I think Earnest is right. I mean, the nature of this, these alleged offenses are so extraordinary that it's going to dominate the campaign, and that is further damage that Donald Trump has inflicted on the American people. Because once again, this is going to be a presidential campaign that is all about Donald Trump, not about the American people.
Here's another question that I was reading this morning, and just a headline. Every opportunity that former President Trump has to campaign, he brings this up. He's talking about, these bogus prosecutions, this, that, and the other. And there was several lawyers that pointed out there are things that he's saying openly on the campaign trail that any normal person who's been indicted would be hauled back into court and probably placed in jail for talking about certain aspects of a criminal case.
Jury tampering.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Trying to basically infect the jury pool. And none of the judges who've been assigned yet have actually brought him back into court and said, hey, we gave you a list of things that you can and cannot do and cannot say, and you violated them. And so that's the thing that just sort of strikes me as being real odd here. I'm waiting for one of these judges, and maybe it'll be the judge in Georgia, to go like, hey, I told you not to do that. You did it. There's a jail cell over there.
Well, it's interesting. Trump is going to lean on free speech, that this is my free speech right. And of course, his defense in all of these cases, I think, is that, well, I wasn't inciting a riot. I was just exercising my right of free speech. If ever there were an instance where the dictum about yelling fire in a crowded theater is, that's one thing that's not covered under free speech, this is it, because you saw what happened. You saw what happened at the Capitol on January 6th. So there are limits to every right, even the most sacred one, of free speech. And so I agree with you, Earnest. I think the judges need to dust off their black robes there and have a little more authority in this. It's because it's crazy.
But looking at it from a journalist standpoint, the journalists have the right to ask the questions. The journalists have the right to try to probe and get as much information as they can. But you, as the defendant in a case, are under certain restrictions.
And moreover, these outbursts aren't coming in response to questions. He's not answering any questions.
That's right.
He's not meeting with reporters at all. He's just giving speeches and popping off. So it hasn't even been provoked. And some of the speech, what he's saying, could clearly incite a crazy person to violence against one of these judges or court officials. So it is, he's personally attacking members of the court, prosecutors, and we've already seen how much violence his speech can conjure up.
Can incite.
So I agree with you. I think it's really problematic.
Okay, so I want to channel in my big wish as we look at what the next months or years look like. I want to channel our friend Mike McKean and also remind journalists we can walk and chew gum, that we don't become so hyper-focused on the minutia of the case and the trials and every hearing and every status update, that we use up all of our resources and have nothing left to cover stories like, well, the catastrophic wildfires that are ravaging Hawaii. More than 100 people have died. It's a story of colonialism and of climate change that's been getting lost by many on the mainland, as a lot of the coverage has focused on the loss of favorite tourist spots and whether some vacation spots are still open or the nostalgia of them, or if it's even possible to still go.
Yeah, and speaking of that, I was there.
Yeah, okay, so transparency. Earnest may have been recently.
I was in Maui.
But it was before the fires.
2 weeks before, about 2.5 weeks before the fire. And, two of our favorite restaurants that we went to while we were there are no longer there. They're gone. I mean, the fire basically took them out. And when I heard about this, the first thing that popped into my head was the fact that there's one way in and one way out of that area. And then when you see those cars, I mean, it's just, it's tragic. But the other thing I thought about was we were on one of the trips up to the mountain to see the sunrise, which is beautiful. And on the way back, the tour guide was talking about climate change and talking about those issues. And the one thing she brought up that sort of stuck with me after watching the tragic events is the one thing that they're always afraid of is fire. And it's a combination of fire and wind. And it had been dry there. They had been dealing with climate change. It hadn't gotten as much rain as they normally would. And the fear of a fire happening while at the same time you have winds coming out the mountain and Lahaina sitting in a pretty much a bowl, there's only one way out, and it's the ocean. And that is exactly what happened. And again, it points to climate change. I mean, it points to the fact that here we've had, in Phoenix, over almost gone on 2 months now of over 110 degree temperatures. We have the heat dome that's been sitting over Texas since May. We're about to, we've had some great weather here in Columbia, but according to this week, it
rained for 10 days or something like that before.
Exactly.
And last month was the hottest month on record anywhere.
And if we listen to the weather forecast, the heat dome is supposed to come back over us this weekend and stay for they don't know how long. So again, you just can't avoid what's happening here. So I agree with you. As journalists and as the media, we've been focusing on this. We can't lose focus on not just what's happening in currently, but where are we going in the future? I think it's important, and you're starting to see that in the number of actual reporters being assigned to cover these various instances of climate change.
Okay, so I mentioned it's been 3 months since we were last here, which means we have a couple of stories that we should have some updates on. We'll go through those quickly. Last week I was in Washington, made a stop at the National Press Club, and saw some signs that were up all over the place about keeping the stories of Austin Tice and Evan Gershkovich front and center, remembering they're both still being held hostage. There have been some minor advancements, Kathy, in Evan Gershkovich's case in the last week or so?
Yeah, well, the U.S. ambassador in Moscow was able to go in and actually see him, which was a small victory because he had not been getting access to American officials. I think, the Wall Street Journal is doing a fantastic job of keeping the spotlight on that case. The Austin Tice case last week was 11 years since he was taken hostage, and his parents were at the National Press Club for a conversation on that day. So I think the news media outlets are doing what they can, but this is just such a difficult problem. And of course, people have said to me, what's going to happen with Evan? And I said, I have no idea, because you're not dealing with a rational person in Vladimir Putin. So it's really hard to know. But I do think keeping the spotlight on and continually saying that name, Evan Gershkovich, and reminding people that he's there is a bit of a shield. I mean, I think as long as Moscow knows people are watching, there's still hope.
Okay. There were talks this weekend in the SAG-AFTRA and the Writers Guild strikes in Hollywood. Still no end in sight on either of those.
Still no end in sight. And the interesting part is that you still have the networks and the streaming services that are putting out as much content as they can. Whatever they have in the can is now coming out. We're going to have more Big Brother and all the other things in the fall, because those are easy shows. There, you don't have to worry about the scripts and those types of things. But I think it points to a larger issue, which is you have various industries, not only the writers and the actors, but you also, we did avert the UPS strike at that point, but you're now the United Auto Workers are talking about they're possibly going on strike against the big three, and a lot of it relates to the fact that you have workers who feel as if they're being left out of what's happening in terms of the economy, and it relates to the billions of dollars that are coming out here.
Okay. Before we go, fun fact about Kathy and me: we're into fiber crafts. Kathy is a knitter. I'm a crocheter. Kathy is an expert.
I wouldn't say that.
Oh, you are. I am a modest novice. But imagine the shock that we both had when we came across a story this week about how journalists are starting to use knitting and crochet and other fiber arts to tell stories visually. Now, if you're watching our show, Kathy and I are each wearing something that we have made. We just also showed an example of a embroidered heat map made by Catherine Mersman, who is one of our grads who now works at NASA. And so she was demonstrating climate change in embroidery. It's an interesting way to approach the concept of data visualization.
Well, and it's interesting because I really think the reason that these crafts are seeing a renaissance is it's kind of the era that Earnest was talking about. I am going to bring him into this fiber thing, whether he likes it or not.
Yarn Saturdays, Earnest, you're coming.
Exactly. But Roosevelt Greer, a noted football player, was a knitter. So there you go. But I think the AI digitization has really given, I see it with our students, this desire for things that are analog and kind of slow cooking. And so it is a great way to de-stress, but I think it's also a response. And it's interesting that people are using it in data viz, because data visualization involves a lot of computing skills and a lot of number crunching. But to take that and translate it into something that's very tactile, and in the case of that embroidery, very beautiful. Yes. It's an antidote, I think, to all the head work.
Yes, and I invite people to go to our links blog. There are examples there of several different ones that have been made by folks, different organizations. That music means that we are pretty much out of time for this week. Thank you for spending the last half hour with us. Read more about each of the topics we talked about today on our links blog under both the programs and podcast tabs at kbia.org. We're available wherever you get your podcast downloads, and you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, that place that now others are calling X. Our handle there is @Views on KBIA. These are all great ways to watch and listen to the program again, leave comments, questions, and see what we'll be talking about next week. Our thanks to RJI's Travis McMillan for directing the show, to Kia Thomas for handling the audio, Tim Pilcher for our theme music. I'm Amy Simons. Join us again next week.